I was just about to say good morning, and I looked at the clock, and it's good afternoon. So glad that you could all make it here, even though we had a scare this morning with some bad weather. We decided to move everything to 1 o'clock today. So glad you could all make it out safely today for our worship service, our one service that we're going to have today. So we're going to have our Bible class today at 1, and then we'll stop at a quarter till, and then we'll have our worship service after that. So you know, Chuck and Debbie are away for a couple of Sundays, so I'm filling in for Chuck this morning in the book of Hebrews. We're in chapter 11, finishing up this chapter. We've been on this chapter for several weeks now. And then Tony has the lesson this afternoon. I said this morning again. And we'll have everything covered today, so we're glad that you're here. Before we start our class, we're going to ask Brian Morris if he would to open the Bible class with a word of prayer.
Our God and our Father, we humbly come before Thee on this day to give Thee thanks for all that You've given to us. We're thankful, Father, for this opportunity to come before You, to offer up our songs of praise, our thanksgiving, and also to come to this period of study that we can learn of You and Your ways. And we pray, Father, that what we learned this morning, we'll be able to apply it to our lives, that we might live in such a way that will be pleasing before You, and that we can be an influence to those that we come in contact with. We pray, Father, that You give us every opportunity to be able to teach those who are lost, that they too may enjoy the blessings that we partake in as well. Pray, Father, that You be our number that are away, especially Chuck as he's traveled. Pray blessings be over him and Debbie. Pray that their journey will be safe. We're also mindful, Father, of our number that are sick, that are dealing with illnesses, and we pray, Father, that You look upon them and touch them in ways that we cannot, and provide a portion of illness to them that their health might be restored. We pray, Father, in all things that Your will be done in our hearts. We offer this prayer in Your Son Jesus. Amen.
Amen. So as you can see on the PowerPoint, we're going to finish up chapter 11 today in verses 30 through 40. Last week we finished up 17 through 29 about Abraham's faith through Moses, and then we did end up reading 30 through 40 at the end of last session and last Sunday. But we want to go ahead and read that again just to get that before us. Talking about faith overcomes. So this is the faith chapter in Hebrews. And then Chuck mentioned that suggested that maybe whoever the teacher was, and that's me now, whoever the teacher is, maybe focus on hardships. And so that's when we read 30 through 40, faith overcomes, and talking about hardships, and faith overcomes hardships. As we read through here, and as you studied, think about the different kinds of hardships and the way our faith can overcome those things. And then when we're through with this 30 through 40, then we'll talk about hardships and how they can affect our lives as Christians. So we'll go ahead and start with Ellen over here. We'll work our way back to the back. We'll read 2 verses apiece. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 30 through 40.
By faith the wall of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient, after she had welcomed the spies in peace.
And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak, and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who in the face of these kingdoms for righteousness obtained promises, stopped mouths of lions,
quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, they might obtain a better resurrection. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even shameful imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in the skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated.
The whole world was not wandering, wandering about in deserts and mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these that committed to their faith did not receive His promise. Since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect.
So having read this, and now we're going to finish up this chapter on faith, we see so many examples here of the faith that different people had in different situations, and because of their faith in God, they're able to either overcome the situation or God came through in His promises. Let's just look at the first one. We're not going to go through all of these, but by faith the walls of Jericho fell down. Now, just blowing trumpets, typically you wouldn't think that's going to make walls fall down, but because God said that's what would happen, then they had the faith that when they did that's exactly what they expected to happen, not earlier, than the seventh time around, but when God said it would. Now, this was for the city of Jericho specifically, right? Now, if they had tried this the next time without God saying this is what's going to happen, would that have worked? No, because God didn't say that, right? So the faith that we have is the faith in the promises of God. And each promise, in this case, when you walk around the city and follow this plan, then this is what's going to happen. So the faith that we have is not based on some blind faith, as we've talked about before. It's based on the promises that God has given us. And so we see that at the end of 39 and 40 here at the end of the chapter, that all these people didn't receive what was promised, but because God has promised something better for us, better for them also. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is about faith overcoming. As Chuck mentioned, let's focus this morning on hardships. And what I wanted to focus on first is, why can hardships cause our faith to waver? And I'm sure we can all have had hardships in our lives, and we have, and our faith, can waver. And not to say that the people that we see the examples here, that their faith may not have wavered at some time or another. But we're going to talk about the perseverance on the flip side of that, but also, from the side when we're weak maybe in our faith, or we're just, with our frailties, as humans, sometimes our faith can waver. So why might our faith waver sometimes? I think I'm not Ellen, but Trey.
I think we feel like we're being punished from God directly when some hardship comes our direction.
Right, that we think, right.
Society definitely thinks that.
Right.
That you must have done something wrong, God wouldn't be punishing you, much like the way people thought about Job. Well, you've got to have done something wrong.
Right. Why would this happen to somebody like you, Job? And is that borne out anywhere? I mean, do we see that anyone was?
Well, there were people that were immediately punished for their sins. I mean, we just talked about Uzzah touching the ark, and he was struck down, or about offering strange fire and things. I mean, there were times in the Old Testament that happened, but there are consequences sometimes for our sins that may happen immediately, but our punishment and our judgment is not until after.
Right. And when our faith wavers, what's the constant that's there that we know that we should trust in? And that it's not in us. The constant is that God always keeps His promise. So if our faith is wavering in some situation, it's not because of God, right? God hasn't left us. It's because we have some kind of doubts or some kind of questions in our life. EJ?
Could it be something like something you want and you don't get it, that thing that you want, but on the back, like God has something but maybe it's not your time to get it.
Right, and we know that better thing that's planned, right, is heaven for us, and so we ask and it doesn't happen, and so we could quit praying, right? We could say, God, please do this for me, please help me have this kind of attitude. If I don't have the right attitude or something doesn't happen, I blame God because it's not happening according to what I want it, how I want it to happen. It's in God's own time, and the answer may still be no.
But isn't it like coming in and praying without ceasing? Or praying with faith, don't let it slip aside or sidestep. Keep on praying without ceasing.
Right, and we should never stop, right? Because God, as I mentioned, God is always there, and we should be doing our part. Janet?
I think when maybe people's faith is wavering or they don't have faith, they can't see past the physical world and, to the spiritual world. I mean, I think that, that's like a barrier there.
Right, because we live in the here and now, right? And so it's difficult for us sometimes when our faith is not what it should be, that we're not thinking about what's been promised to us. We're thinking about, well, what about right now? What about tomorrow? How can I get past, how can I get to the eternity if I can't get past tomorrow? Those kinds of things. And the one thing I was thinking about, we see others without difficulties around us, whether they're Christians or not. Our faith may waver because, well, you're not having any problems, or you're not having any problems. Why should I be having these problems? And so thinking that maybe my faith is not what it should be because somebody else is having this, what seems like no difficulties in their lives. The one thing that could cause our faith to waver is we have a weak prayer life, right? If our prayer life is not what it should be, and we're not having a communication with God, then we should have that. Our faith should waver, because if we don't have an open communication with God and we're not praying to Him, then who are we relying on? We're relying all on ourselves. I can't figure this situation out. Instead of putting our trust in God and knowing that He has something better planned for us, things may not change in our lives, right? But it's about having the proper attitude about dealing with the difficulties that we have. Warren?
Well, we can always look back at the book of Job, what was presented to him, and how he prevailed through those things. And we all have struggles. I mean, I don't know of anyone who really truly doesn't have struggles in their life. At some point in time, it's getting worse than other times. And that's when we get weak. It's when we're faced with those things. Why me? Why is it happening to me? It's very personal. But if we look back at Job and what he endured, at the very end, he weakened, but he never really gave up his faith. And in turn, he was blessed at the end of the day. And I kind of hold on to those things. Most of us never have to endure anything like that he endured. And he did. And he had friends, everybody turned on him more or less. So we can use that as a reference to help us sometimes. And we should, if we have trouble in our lives and we're with other Christians we can talk to help us, we should do that. And like you said, your prayer life. I think you're right about that.
And one other thing is, Ed, we didn't expect a Christian's life to be difficult. So some people I've heard, mention that. Well, I thought as a Christian, if I'm following Christ and doing the things I should, then I shouldn't be having, difficult things in my life. Hardship shouldn't be in my life. Now that's never borne out anywhere in Scriptures, right? If we're Christ-like, did Christ suffer? Right. So if we're Christ, now he suffered, in ways that we would never suffer, and yet sometimes we think that, the things that happen in our lives for some reason I shouldn't have to bear this because I'm a Christian. Who read last? Dustin, was it you? Nancy, could you read 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 10? Right. This is Paul in 2 Corinthians, writing after talking about having the thorn in the flesh. That I'm content with weakness, with insults, with distresses, persecutions, difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. So in order to build our faith, for our faith to build, we have to overcome situations. We have to, our faith has to be built up. So when I've overcome something, is it easier then to overcome something the next time? Right? If we never have any difficulties in our life, then the first time that something comes along, we don't have any experience. Right? Just as if you're a parent, or you remember when you were younger, when something came along in your life you didn't have any experience in it, it's harder to deal with it. And later on, as you get older and older and older and older, that you determine, oh, I've dealt with this before. I can handle this, right? I've seen these kind of situations. I know how I need to go about this. So the experience that we have as Christians and leaning on each other can really help us get through difficult situations, because if I haven't had an issue, but Warren has or Tony has, I can ask them, how did you deal with this? And we can have those kind of discussions with each other and help each other in our lives. So the importance of enduring hardships, as we mentioned, it builds our faith. We're Christ-like, so to be Christ-like, we need to endure hardships. Now, hardships we know will come, right? But it's not like sometimes we're prepared for those things, right? But when they do, then we need to deal with those as a Christian should, in the right way. And I'm sure a lot of us have seen, if not ourselves, somebody having the wrong attitude as a Christian. You think, well, they're a Christian, they shouldn't deal with this kind of thing in this way. But we all have our own frailties, and some of us deal with things easier than others, and so we can lean on each other and help each other. And one thing I think it's important to mention is that we have so many opportunities for other people to see how we deal with the situation versus someone who's not a Christian. And those of you who work with people, and probably most of the people you work with, I'm sure, non-Christians, but you see how they deal with things, and you think they have no no background because a Christian would have on how they should deal with these kind of situations. So they just either throw their hands up, they quit and say this is too hard for me, or they berate somebody in some situation where you would never do that. But we can learn, and we can be the example. We can learn from them how not to do things, but we can be the example to them so that they can cause us to say, why are you handling this so well? And then that gives you the open door that you can talk to them about, well, let me tell you about this peace that I have in my life, this calm that I have because I'm a Christian. And I think the other example is that I thought about is a good example to family and why it's important to endure hardships. And if children see parents and how they handle hardships, and all of you, as children of someone, saw how your parents hopefully handled certain situations well, then it helps you, grow into those things that when you get old enough and you have to make those kinds of decisions, that you make good decisions. When parents teach their children, you need to marry somebody, who's going to be a good spouse to you, a Christian spouse, and look to the future of your children, teaching them, what to expect. So we're teaching others how to handle those situations by being the Christian or the person, the parent, the employer, whatever that we need to be. So I think that's very important to us. So what can perseverance create in us? So we persevere through, these situations. What can that create in us as a Christian or as a person? Dave?
A stronger faith.
Right. So we have a stronger faith because we endure something. We persevere. It's like, this is not going to get me down. Right. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to quit. I'm going to continue to persevere and to go on.
Yeah, we keep praying and put a trust in the Lord, but He always knows what's best. It may not be in the time that we suspect it to be,
But in the proper time, there'll be the right answer.
So what else can perseverance create in us? Patience, right? We want things to happen like that, right? You go through the drive-through. Why is it taking more than a minute, right? Where's my food? You know, even you go to a restaurant or whatever. But patience as a Christian, you know, it's things happen on God's timetable, right? Not ours. One thing, perseverance can create a resistance to temptation, right? We persevere, we build up this resistance to temptation. So once you've overcome something, and then you overcome it again and again and again, then it's easier to then not be tempted, just like building up calluses. You know, this temptation is not going to get me. You know, it's presented to me over and over and over, and you build up that will to say no, 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 till it's just easier and easier and easier, to, at least for, you know, those kinds of things. What about a reliance on God? So if I persevere and I have a good prayer life, resisting temptation, then I'm relying more on God and less on me, right? Is that easy to do? No. Is it a daily battle? Right? It's the constant. It's a journey, and you know we need to get there. Reliance on other Christians. So if you came in here and said, "I need you to pray for me," and you had no confidence anyone in here was going to pray for you, would that give you a good feeling? No, because if you've relied on other people and they've come to you and said, "I'm praying for you in this situation," you hear people in public prayers pray for people who've just been mentioned of, let's remember so-and-so in the situation that they're having, right? And so we hear in those public prayers, you just mentioned that you need my prayers and now I'm praying for you. You know, you get a card, you get a call, whatever, that we rely on each other as Christians, and that can help us get through these situations. But when we see other people, persevering, and it can help in us the same thing. And I think the last thing I had noted here for perseverance is it can create in us a readiness for the next challenge, right? Because we know that somewhere around some corner, you know, there's going to be some situation, and it's, even though we're not always prepared for it, we should have that mindset that when it does happen, then I know, you know, God is there. God is always there, and I should have that prayer life to say, God, give me the strength if something does come up in the future, you know, those kinds of situations where give me the courage not to give up, not to throw in the towel.
And we can abstain from every appearance of evil.
And continue to do that, right? Through perseverance, right? As I mentioned, we build up that, and as Dave mentioned, every appearance of evil, from the time most of you can remember going back with your earliest memory of sin till now, have there been new opportunities and new ways to sin that have come along? Right? I mean, things have been, you know, things are more prevalent now than they were 10 years ago, 15, 20, in some ways. It's always still our decision on whether we sin or not, but there's, you know, the ways to sin and the different avenues and all. I mean, there's different ways to sin, you know, being created all the time. And so we have to, as Christians, we can never get comfortable in our life to say, you know, nothing can ever come here that will tempt me, because as soon as we let our guard down, then there's something there that would tempt us. Dave?
That's right. And as time progresses, there's been more and more ways, like television and computer and things like that. It seems like there's more and more ways a person can be drawn away.
Right, and we all know that when we sin is when we individually are drawn away we all individually give into those desires ourselves. So even though there's new ways and creative ways to sin, it's still always the responsibility is always on us. So is God's promised a worry-free life here on this earth? No. Any promises there no, but God has promised. We read in verse 40, there's something better for us. So there's a home in heaven that's been prepared for. Is it there for everyone? I mean, the offer is available for all, right? But most will reject, just like Christ was rejected in his teaching. But the promise is there for all of us. He's also promised us the escape from temptation, is always there. So when we're tempted, he said there's always an out. And if you don't see it, you're not looking hard enough. You don't have to sin. It's always there for us. And he's promised us, you'll never be tempted beyond what you can handle. There's a look for the out. But if you decide not to, that's when we decided, I don't want the out. I'm going to sin. In let's see, Hannah, can you read Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 18, talking about the characteristic of God that we can count on here. Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 18.
That I see the immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie, might have a strong consolation, with such a refuge to lay hold upon the hope set before us.
All right, so if it's impossible for God to lie, then can we trust his promises? Yes, we can. So how many of you have been let down by some promise? I'm sure I don't need to raise of hands, but at work or by somebody else where somebody has let you down by saying, well, I promise you this, or whether they actually used the word promise, but what they meant was, this is going to happen, and then for whatever reason, it didn't happen. And so you counted on that, you thought that's what was the way it was going to be, and then for whatever reason, the promise didn't come through. Somebody didn't come through with theirs. God cannot lie. So if God tells us something, that there's a home in heaven prepared for us, then we know that it's there. And that's what our faith is built on, God's promises and God keeping his promises. We see so many examples in the Old Testament, New Testament, where God kept his promises. I mean, every example where he promised, it came about. So we can put our faith and build our faith in that, he doesn't lie. And because of that, we have a foundation there that we know when things get difficult, that foundation is not going to shift. Dave, did I see a hand there? No? Okay. So I wanted to look at 4 different areas for our reaction to hardships. So when hardships do come our way, what are some different ways that we might react? Andrew, you want to read 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 12 through 14. 1 Peter chapter 4, 12 through 14.
Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's suffering, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you. The Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. On their part, he is blasphemed, but on your part, he is glorious.
Right, so we should rejoice that we are worthy to suffer as Christ did. So, we're talking about more the suffering that Christ did and the things that we should suffer as Christians. But some of the things that we suffer as Christians, may or may not be because we are a Christian. Health issues, other kinds of things. But when Christ suffered those who didn't agree with his teaching, right? We could still suffer those kinds of things. We have a conversation with somebody about Christ and religious matters. If they don't agree with us, we may not get a promotion. We may be treated a certain way because we're a Christian. Oh well, you're a Christian. They might put you down whatever at work because they just feel like that's what they want to do. And we may suffer in that regard, but we also could suffer afflictions, health kind of issues, hard times, financial issues. But we should rejoice as Christians that we are worthy as Christians to have these difficult situations in our life. Because what we mentioned before was without dealing with these situations in our lives, then how are we ever going to overcome the next one if we can't overcome the first one? So we should rejoice when we get the opportunities to show as Christians that we can handle these situations. Rejoice seeing how somebody else is handling a situation. Another reaction to a hardship would be to resist the temptation and blame God or to retaliate. So, sometimes that's a negative reaction, and we don't want to do that. But I think Trey mentioned that, initially is blame God or to retaliate against somebody else, right? Somebody does something bad to us, well, I'm going to get even with you. So some hardship that comes on with us, you fired me from work. I mean, how many issues you see where people, some shooting in, some parking lot or a plant or something like that because somebody was fired from their job. Well, I'm going to go get even with you. And, a lot of those kinds of situations where people try to take matters into their own hands. Let's look at, Warren, if you could look at, read 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 8 and 9.
I'm sorry, what verses?
1 Peter chapter 5, verses 8 and 9.
Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world.
Right, so knowing that, our brothers and sisters in Christ are having the same difficulties that we are. That whether it's people here that you see, in this assembly, or whether it's somebody in some other state or some other congregation, we hear about people having some of the same difficulties that, in other places that we do here. And we can have sympathy, with them, knowing that they're dealing with the same things that we do. They're not blaming God, hopefully, right? They're not retaliating. So, kind of that mob mentality when you hear about, something starts and people just jump on the bandwagon, everybody kind of goes along that same way. It would be so easy when somebody starts blaming God and other people start jumping on and doing the same thing. And all it takes is one person, somebody, sometimes to do something like that, and people start going in the wrong direction. So as brothers and sisters in Christ, when we hear somebody, having a difficulty like that or whatever, we should step up and, speak to them and, console them or whatever, to have that discussion to say, well, let's look at having a different attitude, or let's look at, how can I help you? Let's study in that area or whatever. Because when people have difficulties, a lot of times what they do is, they want sympathy for them and somebody to feel sorry for them, and they want other people to, having the pity party, and they want to invite everybody. And if we decide we're not going to join that party, we're going to help the person, right? We don't want to reject them. We want to help them with whatever that situation is. So I think we can resist the temptation to sin if they're going in that way as well, by blaming God and saying, you're right, you shouldn't have to do that. And so we need to be supportive of each other and not go the other direction. And another reaction to hardship is to respond, I think, by helping others or doing more good. So that's a positive thing we can do when we have hardships is to help other people, not put so much focus on us, but let me shift my thoughts to somebody else. So if I'm focusing on somebody else who's having a difficulty, I'm not worrying so much about me, and somebody else therefore can worry about you, but you can help each other. So Tina, if you read 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 19.
For this is thankworthy if a man for conscience toward God endures grief, suffering, wrongfully.
Right, so we can bear up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. So sometimes we might suffer, we might have some hardship unjustly for something, nothing that we did. Now, obviously, we can do things that could cause suffering directly. We might have, some problem ourselves that we induce ourselves, but there's sometimes where we might suffer something unjustly. But the point I was making is that responding to others and helping them and doing more good and not focusing so much on ourselves. It's easier, obviously, to do that and not. It's easier to look at ourselves and not doing more. The more things we can get involved in and helping other people, the less we're thinking about, woe is me. Warren?
Well, in James, first chapter, second verse, talks about trials. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. And it goes on to talk about the courage of those things. And I think that's a good passage for us to understand.
Right.
What he's talking about.
And it takes us, I think, a little maturity. Count it all joy when you fall into tribulations, right? The first thing we think of when that happens is typically not joy, right? But that's where we should get to, is that knowing that, okay, now this has happened, my reaction shouldn't be, woe is me. Count it joy that I get to go through this, and my faith gets to be stronger. I get to help out other people. I get to allow other people to help me, right? And we talked about that before. As brothers and sisters in Christ, if we don't let each other know when we need prayers or need support, then you're not allowing somebody else to rally to your aid when you need it. And so, we need it, but we need it from both sides. We need to let somebody else know, I need this, and then they have the ability to say, I've been looking for somebody to help. Yes, now I can go help you because you need my help. So getting involved in those kind of things can help us, I think, take the focus off of us and on somebody else, and therefore we're feeling better. Our reaction to hardships is, and then we talked about this earlier, is to rely on God more for comfort. Julie, if you could read Romans chapter 15 and verse 5. And Tony, if you could get 2 Corinthians 1 verse 3. So Romans 15 and 5. Julie, if you have that one.
Now the God of patience and consolation grant you to be like-minded one toward another according to Christ Jesus.
All right, so God who gives perseverance and encouragement. So God can give us comfort, and He can help us have perseverance. And then Tony has 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 3.
Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercy and God of all comfort.
And go ahead and read verse 4.
Who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God.
Right. It mentions in that one in verse 4, it mentions comfort 3 different ways, 3 different times. How we can help comfort other people, and we're comforted by God. So the comfort that we have is just passed on to others. But the source of all that is God Himself and the promises that He has, and that we can help pass on to other people from our experiences. So we've got about 5 minutes here before we need to wrap up. We think about the hardships, and we think about hardships. We think about Paul. I think a lot of us do, and the things that he endured and the things that he went through. Most of us are never going to be beaten. We're not going to be stoned. We're not going to be shipwrecked. Those kinds of things. But the things that we do go through are just as important to us as those were to him. He was given a thorn in the flesh. So many people are born with some kind of a birth defect or some retardation or something like that, and they live their entire lives with those kind of situations. I mean, that's a hardship that most of us will never ever have to deal with ourselves, and maybe even maybe some family member or so. So just thinking about those kind of things and the way people, especially Christians who have those kind of situations in their lives, and they deal with those things their entire lives. And yet when something comes along in our lives that's something of shorter duration, and we think, how can I handle this? And we don't think about somebody who's been handling something, their entire lives. So it helps us, I think, to think about how blessed and fortunate that we are, that we have, the health, that we have the support that we have from each other, and that many of our hardships are passing, whether it's something that's financial, whether it's health, whether it's work related or whatever. Eventually, in this life, they'll be gone, and we'll still have on this earth, they'll be gone and they'll go away, and they won't return again on this life. But it's not this life that we're looking to, right? It's the life ahead. It's the eternal life. So we sing the song, "This world is not my home." I was thinking about that this morning. I'm just a passing through. The treasures are laid up somewhere else. So the things on this life, they consume us, and we can get so caught up in those things that we lose our focus, and we don't want to do that. So many people have quit or said, I can't do this because life is too tough for me, or they go off on some other avenue, turn to drugs, alcohol, whatever, to cope with those kind of things. And there's always forgiveness. God can, any temptation that we allow, the mindset where we sin and say, God, I just don't think you're listening to me. Like God's going to necessarily give you everything you ask for, and that's not the case. But the home in heaven, that's what's been promised for us, and that's what we can count on. So these hardships, faith overcomes. That's what we're seeing here. All these people who had a faith that allowed them to overcome, and that's what we're trying to build here, individually, and as a congregation, to support each other in the things that happen in our lives that we can all deal with, and let each other know when we need those kinds of support. Well, those are the things I had. I think we're finally finished with chapter 11. So I'm not sure who's teaching class next week, but we'll be on. We'll be in chapter 12, probably. I have to see what. We only go through chapter 11 with what's on the slide here, but I imagine we'll get down probably through halfway through the chapter. So just go ahead and read the whole chapter and get that in front of you for next week, and we'll start with chapter 12, starting out therefore. So since we've completed chapter 11 and all these about faith, and then we start with chapter 12. Therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses, all these that happened before us. So that's where we'll start next week. So thank you for your time today. We'll be dismissed now, just for class.